Let's make a protein tier list. We're going to be ranking how hard each of these is to tackle in the kitchen, so you awesome home cooks can decide what challenges you might want to take on and which ones might be left for another day. In my veg tier list, I didn't explain the levels well enough, but we never make the same mistake twice. So let's dive into our protein tier list. Our lowest level, the easiest to cook, a half-awake koala could cook this. This is the type of stuff that's almost impressive to mess up. Our next level up, still easy, but does require a bit of thinking and skill. We'll call this Basics with Babish. And yes, of course I'm a fan of his videos. Now getting to the middle of the list. This is the stuff that your mom's gonna worry about cooking. A home cook can tackle this reasonably well, but only after looking up some recipes or videos to help them with the finer notes. Let's get on to the harder tiers. We'll call this Gordon Ramsay level, but that might be a little too intense, so we'll say Gordon Ramsay after a few drinks. This is where you need some skill to cook it, but it's not super difficult. A moderately buzzed chef would easily knock these dishes out. And then we have our top tier, literal food wizard. And yes, angry dude in the comments, I am exaggerating a bit when I use the term wizard. You can put your pointy hat away now. So we've got our levels, hardest proteins on top, and the easiest at the bottom. Let's jump into it. First up, we'll throw hot dog at the bottom. Pretty impossible to mess up. No matter what you do to it, it's gonna taste like a salty tube of meat scraps. Next up, this might be a little surprising, but we're gonna throw the Beyond Meat burger in that same category. With this, you can pretty much eat it raw, though it's gonna taste like garbage. There's not a whole lot of tricks to cooking the Beyond Meat burger. It's a pretty synthetic product that's been squeezed out of a factory tube, but it does contain no meat products and it's a good vegan alternative if it's something that you actually enjoy eating. Another one that's pretty easy to put down into the lowest tier list is going to be bacon. You don't have to pay any attention to it. It's pretty much a set it and forget it food. Though you can also do it in a pan if you like those little crispy bits on the edges a bit more and you're okay with the inconsistency that comes from pan cooking it. Another one that's going in the bottom is definitely the chicken wing. It's another set it and forget it. Turn your oven on, put them in. You can toss them in some sauce. It's pretty easy. Chicken wings don't take a whole lot of skill, and honestly, they're delicious for the amount of effort you put into them. We'll go up one more level in our tier list to our basics, and I would say a good one to throw in here to start off and kind of show what this tier is going to be about is putting up our sausages. So let's throw sausages into this category. Now, compared to the hot dog, you've got to sear both sides if you want to get some nice color and flavor on them, so it's a little more skilled than the hot dog, but overall, let's be real, they're not a huge effort food to be cooking. Another one that follows that same trend that takes a little bit of effort and a little bit of skill, but isn't too difficult, we'll put mussels in this list. You can just throw them in a pot, get some beer in there, get some white wine, some butter, whatever you throw in there, they're going to be pretty good. The only problem you can have with these is if you severely overcook them, they can get a bit chewy. But overall, I put mussels in the basic category. Another one that's not too tricky is chickpeas. The most common preparations I see for this is either blitzing them into a hummus or working them into some kind of vegetarian creamy curry, and they do great in both of those areas. So chickpeas, very low effort, but they bring a lot of flavor, they bring a lot of protein, they're a pretty good nutritious addition to a lot of foods. Another one that takes a little bit of skill but a lot less effort than people think is a good old roast chicken. Now for this, you're just slathering on some flavor. If you want to get really technical with it, you can get out a syringe and start stabbing it full of brine, but overall, pretty little work for how good it is. Another one we can put into the fairly basic category is ground beef, whether you're turning it into meatballs, turning it into burgers, or just sauteing it and then adding it to a bolognese sauce. Ground beef's pretty forgiving. It's got such a high fat content that it's rarely going to get too dry, and it just brings a ton of flavor without putting in a huge amount of effort into making it tasty. Now let's go up to the middle of our tier list. This is the kind of thing that the average home cook might be a little bit worried about, but could definitely tackle and not be too afraid of. For this, let's start off. We're going to put shrimp into this list. Now shrimp is pretty quick to cook. It isn't that difficult, but the main thing that can be a problem with it is that if it does get overcooked, it can get very dry, very chewy, and just be very unpalatable. So we're going with the middle on this shrimp because it's a little less forgiving than you might expect. Another one we can put next to it here is the swordfish. Now swordfish might seem like an intimidating ingredient for many home cooks to jump into, but in terms of fish, it's much more forgiving than a lot of them. Another one we can say is sort of in the middle of the tier list is the good old roast ham. Quite a classic. Most home cooks are going to be comfortably able to knock out a good honeyed ham or something of that sort. In a similar vein, we can throw the pork chop. This is going to take more skill if you're butchering down your own pork chops. If you're just buying them at your local butcher and then searing them on the stove or searing them on a grill, pork chops are pretty manageable and not that difficult. They're also quite flavorful and don't require a huge amount of prep, so I'd say pork chops are a comfortable middle tier. Okay, so let's go up one more level and we're going to get into the kind of stuff that's a little more tricky, and I'm going to explain to you why. First up in this list, we're going to throw salmon. I know you're looking down here and you're saying, wait, swordfish versus salmon, is it really that difficult? There's two reasons that I'm going to say that salmon is much more difficult than swordfish. The first is that if you're grilling it or pan searing searing it. Salmon's quite a delicate meat and can easily fall apart, so you've got to be treating it with a bit of care and a bit of caution and not beating it up as you grill it and move it around. It can also get extremely dry and unpalatable if you overcook salmon. Salmon is something you want to keep an eye on because it can go from perfect to overcooked in a minute or two. You really want to be paying attention to that type of protein. Another one we can put next to our humble salmon is duck. So duck is a bit more tricky than your average protein, but can also be extremely rewarding if you get a beautiful sear onto the fat. We'll also put next to duck, lobster. Now cooking lobster isn't that difficult. Most of the time you're throwing it into a pot, you're taking it out, you're breaking it up and dipping it in some beautiful butter. Dealing with an ingredient that's living like live shrimp or live lobster can be a bit intimidating, and that's understandable. So we're putting lobster a little bit higher on the tier list. Another one that we can throw into our higher tier list is going to be the pork loin. Now for pork loin, most of the time the way you're going to handle this is you're going to be searing the outside of the pork loin, and then you're going to be throwing it into the oven to cook it all of the way through. Now the searing process, not too hard. It's a nice cylinder, it's easy to manage, but you want to be managing the temperature of searing it and then also the temperature when it's going into the oven. So it's a bit notorious in terms of getting dried out if you do overcook it. This is the type of ingredient where a meat thermometer is really going to help you, so you can check that internal temperature. You don't want to go under with pork. It needs to be cooked all the way through, but also if you go over, it's going to get dry. Another one that might need a little explanation is the catfish. Now the most common preparation you're going to see from catfish, kind of a southern US tradition, is shaving catfish, then breading it and deep frying it. This is a fairly regional dish that people enjoy, and I've had it a couple times and absolutely love it, but can't say I've cooked catfish a whole lot. It's just not really in my repertoire. So catfish, I think for some home cooks might be quite comfortable, while others would find it a little strange, a little difficult. Shaving it, breading it, frying it, a little bit difficult. That's pretty understandable. So we'll put tofu in the higher tier category here. Tofu in some recipes, if you're throwing it into a curry and just simmering it, extremely easy to work with, and I could easily have put it down in kind of the half-awake koala versus basics area, but I'm gonna put it a little bit higher just because I feel tofu is an ingredient that most home cooks are not as comfortable with as they might want to be. There's also a huge variety of ways to do it, so it could be a little bit trickier for some people. I'll try to cover as many tofu recipes on this channel as I possibly can. Okay, let's start getting into our highest tier ingredients here. These are the ingredients that are going to be particularly tricky. You want to really kind of plan out how you're going to be cooking this and maybe do a little bit more research than you would for some of the ingredients in our lower tiers. So first up we'll throw here is the halibut. The reason halibut is so tricky is it's a fish, so we want to be careful about overcooking it. It's also a fish with a notoriously low fat content. Fat's going to keep the meat moist. With very little fat like you have in a halibut, it can dry out very easily. As well, if you want to make your halibut as good as possible, you're going to want to get that skin quite crispy. So you've got a number of different factors you want to be working with here. It's definitely also on the more expensive side of protein ingredients, so it's not super forgiving. It's quite expensive. However, a well-cooked piece of halibut is so beautiful. This is just an incredible fish if that's your thing. So it's a little tricky, but honestly, it might be worth learning. Another one we're going to put in this category is the steak. Now I did struggle a bit whether I wanted to put the steak somewhere closer to the middle, somewhere in the bottom, or somewhere in the top, because it really comes down to how you want to cook the steak. If you're going for a steak that's well done, you can easily put this in the very bottom. You're happy to cook it all the way through. Whereas if you're trying to get that buttery, medium rare steak that you might get at a really premium French restaurant, that's pretty tricky to hit. You've got a small margin of error. You can't really do it with a meat thermometer. Most cooks are going to be doing it by touching the steak over and over again and feeling how cooked through the steak is. This is going to make the steak a little more tricky and is definitely the type of thing that requires some practice. Another one that's a little more tricky for your average cook is going to be scallops. Now scallops are tricky for two different reasons. One, you want to make sure the scallops are patted perfectly dry before they go into the pan. If there's any moisture on the scallops when they go into the pan, and they're going to stick and they're going to get ruined and they're just going to end up looking like shredded scallops and be somewhat destroyed. You can still eat them, they're still food, but they're not going to be that beautiful scallop you imagine when you go to a restaurant. The second part of scallops that makes them tricky is that they can be easily overcooked. You really want to manage the heat in your pan or however you're cooking it. You want to make sure that it's cooked, but just barely cooked through so that it's moist and it's not that chewy, overcooked scallop. And lastly, to finish off our tier list, the final one we're going to look at is oysters. Now, two ways you can do oysters. You can definitely cook them or you can do them raw. In both cases, you're going to be shucking oysters, which is a little tricky. Once you get the hang of it though, you'll be knocking out oysters in 10 seconds each. That being said, for a home cook who hasn't shucked oysters before or is a little less familiar with this ingredient, it's completely reasonable that the oyster might be a little bit tricky tricky for someone who hasn't done it before. You'll have to get yourself a shucking knife, a particular tool for this, and it takes a little skill to get down the habit of knocking that shell off, separating the oyster from the bottom, and not losing that beautiful juice that's inside. For that reason, I'm going to put oysters higher on our tier list. They're quite a treat. I'm an absolute fan of oysters, but I do get that for home cooks it might be on the more difficult side. So we've made it to the end of our tier list, and if you're still here watching, I just want to say a big thanks for checking out my channel and learning about some protein with me. If you have other categories of food that you want to suggest, I'll gladly take a look at them. And again, thanks for watching.